Tonight, we are stepping toward the quiet margins of prehistory, where the last mammoths walked without knowing they were the last. When we think of mammoths, we imagine the Ice Age, vast frozen plains, glaciers stretching to the horizon, herds moving through snow. And that's true. Mammoths were built for that world, and they thrived in it for hundreds of thousands of years. But here's what's easy to forget: the Ice Age ended, and the mammoths didn't. Long after the glaciers melted, long after forests returned, and coastlines reshaped themselves, mammoths were still out there, walking, grazing, raising calves, not as scattered survivors clinging to existence, but as quiet populations continuing the only life they knew. Scientists were stunned when they realized how recently the last ones lived. While humans in Egypt were building pyramids, there were still mammoths on a small island in the Arctic. Not fossils, living animals, breathing the same air as the early civilizations we read about in history books. They didn't vanish in a catastrophe. There was no fire, no flood, no single terrible day. Tonight, we'll walk with them through those final centuries. We'll visit the islands where they held on the longest, and we'll sit with the quiet question of what it means to survive everything and still, eventually. But before we begin, if you find comfort in these gentle journeys through science stories, it would mean the world to me if you gave this video a gentle like and perhaps tapped subscribe. It helps more curious minds like you find their way to this peaceful little corner of the internet. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? I love seeing how far across the world these soft explorations travel. Now, let your breath slow, let your body settle, and together, let's drift back to the islands where the last mammoths walked. The mammoths themselves were not simply cold versions of modern elephants, but bodies tuned carefully to a world that demanded patience more than speed. Their size reflected this purpose. Compared to elephants today, mammoths carried heavier frames with thicker bones and broader bodies, weight spread low and wide to conserve heat and stability rather than quick movement. Their fur was not a single coat but a layered system, long coarse hairs forming a protective outer curtain, while dense underfur held warmth close to the skin. Beneath that, thick reserves of fat wrapped their bodies like stored seasons, insulation and energy combined, allowing them to endure long winters and unpredictable shortages without constant feeding. Even their blood moved differently, guided through vessels that slowed circulation in exposed areas, protecting core warmth while keeping legs, ears, and trunk functional in bitter cold. Tusks curved forward and outward with purpose, shaped not just by display or combat, but by daily labor, sweeping aside snow, breaking ice, and reshaping frozen ground to reach buried grass. Each feature spoke of survival, measured not in bursts of effort, but in years of steady endurance, walking, standing, and feeding through landscapes that changed slowly but relentlessly. Inside these massive bodies lived minds built for memory, recognition, and social continuity. Mammoths were highly intelligent animals, closer in behavior to modern elephants than their size alone suggests, yet sharpened by lives spent in vast open spaces where knowledge could mean survival. Herds moved together along remembered routes, guided by older members who carried the map of the land in their minds. Places where grass returned earliest, valleys sheltered from harsh winds, river crossings that froze solid before others. Memory was not abstract for them, it was geography, seasons, and safety woven together. Calves learned by watching and following, absorbing patterns repeated over decades rather than days. Social bonds were strong and persistent, with family groups staying together across many years, sharing care for the young and responding collectively to danger. Communication relied on deep, low sounds that traveled far across open plains. Vibrations felt as much as heard, linking individuals even when they could not see one another. In a world where visibility could vanish in snow or darkness, connection mattered more than sight. Time moved slowly for mammoths, and their lives were structured around that pace. They lived long lives, often stretching across many decades, and their reproduction followed the same patient rhythm. Calves were few, born after long pregnancies and raised with extended care. Years passed between births, making every new generation precious, but also limiting how quickly populations could grow or recover. This was not a weakness in a stable world. It was a strategy built for predictability, where landscapes shifted gradually and familiar routes remained usable across many lifetimes. Mammoths invested deeply in each offspring, ensuring that knowledge, behavior, and survival skills were passed down carefully rather than hurriedly. Their bodies and societies assumed time would remain generous, that adaptation could unfold across centuries instead of seasons. All of this reveals why mammoths were creatures of endurance rather than speed. They were not designed to flee constantly or react instantly to change, but to persist through it. Their strength lay in consistency, in returning to the same grazing grounds year after year, in trusting patterns that had held for thousands of winters. Movement was steady, measured, efficient, conserving energy rather than spending it in bursts. Even their massive size supported this approach, storing heat, resisting hunger, and discouraging predators without the need for constant vigilance. Mammoths belonged to a world that rewarded patience, where survival came from knowing when to wait, when to move, and when to endure. This design served them extraordinarily well for most of their existence, allowing them to thrive through cycles of cold and warmth, abundance and scarcity. It shaped not only how they lived, but how they understood their world as something that could be remembered, anticipated, and trusted to return again. The realization arrived quietly, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a steady tightening of timelines that no longer fit the old story. For a long time, mammoths had lived comfortably in the distant past, placed far beyond human memory, safely folded into the closing scenes of the Ice Age. Their disappearance was thought to belong to a world of glaciers and primitive landscapes, separated cleanly from the rise of towns, writing, and stone monuments. That sense of distance made their extinction feel complete and ancient, something finished long before human history truly began. But as dating methods improved and old bones were tested again with greater care, the margin between mammoths and civilization began to shrink, year by year, until it settled in an unexpectedly recent place. Radiocarbon measurements drawn from tusks, teeth, and bone fragments revealed that some mammoths were alive far later than anyone had imagined, walking the tundra only a few thousand years ago, long after ice sheets had retreated and forests had spread across much of the north. This new timeline created an unsettling overlap, one that refused to stay abstract once it was seen clearly. At the same moment mammoths were grazing on windswept Arctic islands, humans elsewhere were laying stone upon stone along the Nile, shaping monuments that still rise above the sand today. While early Egyptian pyramids took form under the sun, mammoths stood beneath polar skies, breathing cold air, moving through familiar paths etched into frozen ground. These were not separate eras divided by an invisible wall. They were parallel moments sharing the same planet. The mammoths were not prehistoric shadows fading out before history began. They were living animals existing alongside organized societies, agriculture, and written language. The past and the familiar suddenly occupied the same frame, and that collision was difficult to ignore once seen. For extinction science, this overlap changed more than dates. It reshaped how disappearance itself was understood. Mammoths could no longer be described as casualties of a single ancient catastrophe that cleared the stage for modern life. Their survival into a recognizable human world forced scientists to reconsider the pace and texture of extinction, revealing it as something that could unfold quietly alongside progress rather than ending neatly before it. The idea that large iconic animals vanished swiftly in a distant age gave way to a more complex picture, one where species could persist through major environmental change, adapt in small ways, and still slowly fade while other forms of life advanced around them. Extinction stopped being a punctuation mark and became a long sentence, written across centuries rather than moments. This discovery also exposed how assumptions had shaped earlier interpretations. For generations, researchers believed mammoths had been gone for tens of thousands of years, erased near the close of the last glacial period. That belief influenced excavation priorities, museum displays, and even popular imagination. Bones found in certain layers were automatically dated to deep time, their true age rarely questioned. When later tests pushed mammoth survival forward by thousands of years, it became clear that absence from the record did not always mean absence from the world. In remote places far from the centers of early civilization, mammoths had continued their routines largely unseen, leaving behind only subtle traces that were easy to misplace in the timeline. The shock was not that the data existed, but that it had taken so long to recognize what it was saying. As this revised understanding settled in, it carried a gentle but profound implication. If mammoths could survive into an age of cities and monuments without leaving obvious marks in human memory, then extinction did not always announce itself in ways that observers could recognize at the time. A species could still walk, reproduce, and behave normally while slipping beyond the margins of attention. The world could appear full even as it quietly became poorer. The mammoths lived during an era humans consider foundational, yet their presence left almost no imprint on written history. Their disappearance unfolded in the background, unnoticed by most, while human stories moved forward in the foreground. In this softened light, the late survival of mammoths does not feel like a contradiction, but a reminder of how uneven awareness can be across the planet. Life does not vanish all at once or in unison. Some corners of the world hold on longer than others, carrying older rhythms into newer times. Mammoths remained part of Earth's living fabric long after they were assumed gone, sharing the planet with early civilizations without ever crossing into shared story. Their persistence reshaped scientific understanding, not through drama, but through quiet alignment of dates, layers, and time itself, revealing that the boundary between prehistory and history was far thinner and far more porous than anyone had once believed. Wrangel Island sits far to the north, surrounded by cold, shifting water, a fragment of land that feels less like a destination and more like a leftover piece of another age. It rises low and broad from the Arctic Ocean, shaped by wind, ice, and silence, its coastlines rough and irregular, its interior rolling gently rather than sharply. For much of the year, it is locked in snow and cold air, yet beneath that stillness lies a landscape that once offered something increasingly rare to large animals elsewhere: continuity. While continents changed rapidly after the great ice sheets retreated, this island remained steadier, insulated by its isolation and its latitude. Sea levels rose and quietly cut it off from the mainland, not through violence, but through slow, patient flooding that erased the land bridge connecting it to Siberia. Once separated, the island became its own world, small enough to be overlooked, distant enough to escape many of the forces reshaping the rest of the planet. Grasslands persisted longer here, nourished by dry Arctic air and soils that favored low vegetation over encroaching forests. Where trees spread across former mammoth ranges on the mainland, altering food availability and fragmenting open spaces. Wrangel Island held onto a simpler structure. Wind kept snow from piling too deeply in places, revealing forage even in winter, and the short summers brought bursts of growth that sustained grazing animals used to scarcity. In this narrow balance, mammoths found conditions that still matched their bodies, their diets, and their long inherited routines. Survival on Wrangel Island was not easy, but it was possible in ways that the wider world no longer allowed. There were fewer predators, fewer competitors, and less pressure from rapid ecological shifts. Human presence remained minimal for a long time, limited by distance, harsh conditions, and difficult access. While elsewhere expanding populations altered landscapes through fire, hunting, and settlement, the island remained largely untouched, its rhythms governed by weather and seasons rather than tools or planning. For mammoths accustomed to enduring rather than adapting quickly, this mattered deeply. Their lives depended on stability more than abundance, on predictability more than opportunity. On the mainland, environments were transforming too quickly, grasslands breaking apart into forest patches, wetlands forming where dry ground once lay, migration routes narrowing and eventually vanishing. On Wrangel Island, there were no migrations left to lose. The island itself defined the limits of movement, and within those limits, mammoths could still live as they always had. They walked familiar ground repeatedly, returned to the same feeding areas, and raised calves in landscapes that changed little from year to year. The island acted not as a sanctuary designed to protect them, but as a pause, a place where the accelerating changes elsewhere reached them only slowly. Yet this refuge came with a cost that was not immediately visible. Isolation meant that no new mammoths arrived once the land bridge disappeared. The population became closed, shaped entirely by those already present and the calves they produced. In the short term, this isolation reduced threats, but over generations it quietly altered the balance that had sustained them for so long. Still, for centuries, life continued in familiar patterns. Mammoths grazed, rested, and moved across the island, much as their ancestors had across vast continents. Seasons came and went, storms passed, calves were born, and elders led herds across ground they knew by heart. The island did not feel like a last stand to the animals living there. It felt like home. At the edge of the world, far from the sweeping changes unfolding elsewhere, Wrangel Island became the final place where mammoths remained part of the living earth. Their presence there was not marked by drama or struggle visible from afar. It was marked by persistence, by ordinary days repeating themselves against a quiet backdrop of snow, grass, and wind. The island held on to them not through abundance or protection, but through stillness, offering a narrow window where an ancient way of life could continue just a little longer. Wrangel Island sits far to the north, surrounded by cold, shifting water, a fragment of land that feels less like a destination and more like a leftover piece of another age. It rises low and broad from the Arctic Ocean, shaped by wind, ice, and silence, its coastlines rough and irregular, its interior rolling gently rather than sharply. For much of the year, it is locked in snow and cold air, yet beneath that stillness lies a landscape that once offered something increasingly rare to large animals elsewhere: continuity. While continents changed rapidly after the great ice sheets retreated, this island remained steadier, insulated by its isolation and its latitude. Sea levels rose and quietly cut it off from the mainland, not through violence, but through slow, patient flooding that erased the land bridge connecting it to Siberia. Once separated, the island became its own world, small enough to be overlooked, distant enough to escape many of the forces reshaping the rest of the planet. Grasslands persisted longer here, nourished by dry Arctic air and soils that favored low vegetation over encroaching forests. Where trees spread across former mammoth ranges on the mainland, altering food availability and fragmenting open spaces, Wrangel Island held onto a simpler structure. Wind kept snow from piling too deeply in places, revealing forage even in winter, and the short summers brought bursts of growth that sustained grazing animals used to scarcity. In this narrow balance, mammoths found conditions that still matched their bodies, their diets, and their long inherited routines. Survival on Wrangel Island was not easy, but it was possible in ways that the wider world no longer allowed. There were fewer predators, fewer competitors, and less pressure from rapid ecological shifts. Human presence remained minimal for a long time, limited by distance, harsh conditions, and difficult access. While elsewhere expanding populations altered landscapes through fire, hunting, and settlement, the island remained largely untouched, its rhythms governed by weather and seasons rather than tools or planning. For mammoths accustomed to enduring rather than adapting quickly, this mattered deeply. Their lives depended on stability more than abundance, on predictability more than opportunity. On the mainland, environments were transforming too quickly, grasslands breaking apart into forest patches, wetlands forming where dry ground once lay, migration routes narrowing and eventually vanishing. On Wrangel Island, there were no migrations left to lose. The island itself defined the limits of movement, and within those limits, mammoths could still live as they always had. They walked familiar ground repeatedly, returned to the same feeding areas, and raised calves in landscapes that changed little from year to year. The island acted not as a sanctuary designed to protect them, but as a pause, a place where the accelerating changes elsewhere reached them only slowly. Yet this refuge came with a cost that was not immediately visible. Isolation meant that no new mammoths arrived once the land bridge disappeared. The population became closed, shaped entirely by those already present and the calves they produced. In the short term, this isolation reduced threats, but over generations it quietly altered the balance that had sustained them for so long. Still, for centuries, life continued in familiar patterns. Mammoths grazed, rested, and moved across the island, much as their ancestors had across vast continents. Seasons came and went, storms passed, calves were born, and elders led herds across ground they knew by heart. The island did not feel like a last stand to the animals living there. It felt like home. At the edge of the world, far from the sweeping changes unfolding elsewhere, Wrangel Island became the final place where mammoths remained part of the living earth. Their presence there was not marked by drama or struggle visible from afar. It was marked by persistence, by ordinary days repeating themselves against a quiet backdrop of snow, grass, and wind. The island held on to them not through abundance or protection, but through stillness, offering a narrow window where an ancient way of life could continue just a little longer. When a species becomes trapped, the change is not marked by panic or confusion, but by a quiet narrowing of options that unfolds over many generations. For mammoths confined to shrinking ranges and islands, migration did not end with a dramatic barrier or a sudden loss. It faded as a possibility. Routes that once connected summer and winter grazing grounds slowly dissolved into water, forest, or terrain that no longer supported their needs. What remained were familiar paths that looped back on themselves, known landscapes walked again and again until every rise, hollow, and windbreak was remembered in detail. Movement continued, but it no longer led outward. The seasonal rhythm of travel became internal, contained within borders that did not shift to meet hardship. In earlier ages, migration had been a form of problem solving, a way to respond to drought, cold, or scarcity by changing location rather than changing body or behavior. Once that option vanished, endurance replaced flexibility. Mammoths stayed and adapted only in place, absorbing stress rather than escaping it, relying on strength, fat reserves, and collective memory to carry them through conditions they could no longer avoid. At the same time, isolation reshaped life in ways that were invisible day to day, but powerful across centuries. With no new individuals entering the population, no distant herds joining through shared corridors, the genetic story of the mammoths began to fold inward. Each generation inherited a narrower version of what came before, not because of weakness or failure, but because variety requires connection. Traits once balanced by exchange now circulated within a closed circle, repeating themselves with slight variations. Over long stretches of time, rare changes that might once have been diluted or offset became more common simply because there was nowhere else for diversity to come from. This was not an immediate collapse of health or behavior. Mammoths continued to grow, reproduce, and function much as they always had. Calves were born strong enough to walk and learn. Adults carried on familiar roles. Herds maintained structure and cohesion. Yet beneath this surface continuity, the population's resilience slowly thinned. Like a library that no longer adds new volumes, the genetic archive became complete but limited, capable of preserving the past but less able to respond to unfamiliar challenges. Survival, under these conditions, turned into a closed system. Everything the mammoths needed to persist had to be generated from within their remaining world, from the land they still occupied and the inherited traits they still carried. There was no outside reinforcement, no chance encounter with distant relatives bringing fresh variation or new responses shaped by different environments. Success depended increasingly on stability. When seasons followed expected patterns, when food returned on schedule, when winters remained within familiar bounds, life continued smoothly. The system worked because it had been refined over thousands of years to function under predictable pressure. But closed systems are sensitive to disruption, not because they are fragile, but because they lack spare paths. A run of difficult years could not be offset by relocation. A shift in vegetation could not be met by expanding into untouched plains. Even small changes accumulated weight because there was no outlet, no release of pressure into a wider world. For the mammoths living this way, none of this registered as danger. Their days were filled with ordinary acts: grazing, resting, tending to young, following elders along routes worn smooth by repetition. Knowledge still passed from one generation to the next, but it covered a smaller map. Experience still mattered, but its scope was reduced. The world felt complete because it was known entirely, yet that completeness carried a subtle cost. When every place is familiar, surprise has nowhere to go. Chance events, a severe winter, a disease, a poor breeding season, did not arrive as part of a larger pattern that could be navigated around. They arrived directly, pressing inward on a population that could only respond internally. Over time, this quiet enclosure reshaped what survival meant. It became less about thriving within a vast landscape and more about maintaining balance within a limited one. Mammoths were remarkably well suited to this for a long while, drawing on deep reserves of endurance built into their bodies and societies. But the closed nature of their existence meant that survival rested on narrow margins. margins that could hold for many generations, and then suddenly, gently, slip. Nothing dramatic announced the change. The system continued to function until, gradually, it could not do so quite as well as before, and then not as well again, as life carried on inside boundaries that no longer allowed recovery from the smallest misalignments. By the time the last mammoths were gone, they left behind more than bones and silence. Inside their remains, locked deep within cells preserved by cold and time, was another record of their story, written not in stone or landscape, but in sequences so small they could only be read long after the animals themselves had vanished. When scientists learned how to extract and sequence mammoth genomes, they were not simply identifying a species, they were listening to echoes of lives lived across generations, tracing inheritance the way one might follow a faint trail through snow that has mostly settled smooth again. Ancient DNA does not survive easily. It breaks apart, frays at the edges, and fades with every passing year. That mammoth DNA could be recovered at all was due to the same Arctic cold that once preserved their bodies and slowed decay. Piece by piece, researchers assembled these fragments, comparing them across individuals separated by time and geography, allowing patterns to emerge slowly and carefully. The genomes did not speak of sudden catastrophe or abrupt collapse. Instead, they revealed continuity first, long stretches where mammoths remained genetically robust enough to function as they always had, followed by subtle shifts that only became visible when viewed across many generations at once. Ancient DNA has a particular way of telling stories. It does not describe landscapes or behavior directly. Instead, it reflects pressure and response, the quiet consequences of isolation, small population sizes, and limited choice. In the genomes of late mammoths, scientists began to see signs that variety was thinning. Genetic diversity, once broad enough to buffer against change, became narrower, like a river losing its side channels and flowing through a single, constrained course. Certain mutations appeared more frequently, not because they were useful, but because there were fewer alternatives competing alongside them. Traits that would once have been rare or diluted persisted simply because the population had nowhere else to draw from. This was not a dramatic breakdown of function. Mammoths with these genetic signatures still lived, moved, and reproduced. Their bodies still grew thick fur, built fat reserves, and carried them through winter. The decline revealed by DNA was quiet and cumulative, detectable only through careful comparison, a pattern visible to modern science, but invisible to the animals living it day by day. As scientists looked more closely at the genomes of the last known mammoths, particularly those from the final island populations, the record grew clearer. There were signs of increased genetic load, the accumulation of changes that did not immediately kill but reduced resilience at the margins. Genes involved in smell, immunity, and reproduction showed subtle disruptions, not enough to stop life, but enough to make it less flexible. In a wide, interconnected world, such changes might have been offset by mixing with other populations. In a closed system, they remained and multiplied quietly. The DNA revealed that mammoths did not fail to adapt out of weakness or error. They adapted as best they could with what they had, generation after generation, within narrowing limits. Their genetic story was not one of sudden deterioration, but of endurance stretched thin. What made these discoveries especially striking was how well they aligned with everything else already known about the mammoth's final centuries without repeating it. The shrinking world, the loss of migration, the isolation of populations all left their signature not only on the land and the fossil record, but inside the genome itself. The DNA acted like a memory of constraints, preserving the long-term effects of living without replenishment. It showed that extinction does not require a dramatic final blow. It can emerge from a slow mismatch between the pace of environmental change and the speed at which genetic systems respond, especially in species built for stability rather than rapid adjustment. Yet, even here, in this deepest layer of evidence, there is no sense of collapse in the ordinary meaning of the word. The last mammoths were not genetic wrecks staggering toward inevitable failure. They were functioning animals whose inherited options had gradually narrowed. Their genomes tell a story of life continuing under increasing pressure, of survival maintained until the margin for error disappeared entirely. The reading of mammoth DNA does not replace other evidence. It completes it, adding an intimate, internal perspective on how long survival can persist, even as the conditions that support it slowly fade. Through these sequences, preserved against time, the last mammoths remain present in a different way, not as living bodies on frozen ground, but as patterns that still carry the imprint of endurance, isolation, and the quiet arithmetic of survival within a world that had grown too small. The changes unfolding within the last mammoth populations did not arrive as visible wounds or obvious failures, but as a gradual thinning of strength that only became clear when viewed across generations. Harmful mutations, which arise naturally in all living things, had always existed among mammoths, appearing quietly and usually disappearing just as quietly when balanced by healthier variation. In large, connected populations, these changes rarely linger. They are softened by choice and chance, diluted as individuals from different lineages mix and pass forward a wider range of traits. But within the closed worlds the mammoths now occupied, those gentle corrections no longer occurred. Mutations that once would have been rare began to persist, not because they helped survival, but because there were fewer alternatives to replace them. Over time, these small flaws accumulated, not dramatically, but steadily, like tiny cracks spreading through stone that still appears solid from the outside. None of this meant immediate sickness or visible decline. Mammoths continued to grow thick coats, store fat, and move with the slow confidence their bodies had always known. Yet beneath that surface, the balance that had long protected them was shifting. As genetic diversity declined, the population's inner landscape became simpler and more repetitive. Each generation inherited a slightly narrower range of possibilities, fewer subtle variations in form, metabolism, and response. This narrowing did not strip mammoths of their identity or erase their way of life. They remained mammoths in every outward sense. Their herds still followed familiar routes, calves still learned from elders, and the rhythm of seasons still shaped daily behavior. But genetic diversity is less about appearance and more about options. It provides flexibility, a quiet reserve that allows life to absorb unexpected pressure. As that reserve thinned, mammoths became more dependent on stability. Conditions that matched their long evolved design remained manageable. Conditions that deviated even slightly carried more weight than before. The population did not crumble under this strain. It adapted as it always had, slowly and conservatively, maintaining function while losing margin. What makes this period especially striking is how normal life likely appeared from within. Survival did not halt. Calves were still born. Adults still reached maturity. Many individuals lived full lifespans by any visible measure. The weakening resilience revealed by genetic studies was not a signal felt by the animals themselves. It existed at the level of probabilities rather than experiences, shaping outcomes over long stretches of time rather than moments. A slightly higher chance that an illness would spread. a slightly lower chance that a difficult winter would be survived, a slightly reduced capacity to recover after a poor breeding year. None of these changes announced themselves. Together, they slowly altered the balance between persistence and loss. This quiet unraveling reflects a deeper truth about extinction that is often overlooked. Species do not need to fail dramatically to disappear. They can continue to function, even to endure, while their ability to withstand rare stress declines incrementally. For mammoths, the environment they occupied had already narrowed. Now, the biological systems that once allowed them to rebound from hardship were narrowing as well. The world outside offered fewer options, and the world within mirrored that reduction. Survival continued, but it became more fragile, dependent on a string of favorable conditions rather than a broad foundation of resilience. Even as this process unfolded, there was nothing inevitable in the daily lives of the mammoths. They were not collapsing under genetic weight. They were living within constraints that grew tighter over time. The accumulation of harmful mutations did not strip them of movement, awareness, or social bonds. It simply reduced the range of futures available to the population as a whole. Each generation inherited a world that still worked, but worked less generously than before. The continuity of life masked the slow erosion beneath it. Seen from a distance, across centuries compressed into data and analysis, this period can appear like a decline. Seen from within, it was simply life continuing. The mammoths did not know their resilience was weakening. They knew only the present, the grass beneath snow, the shelter of familiar ground, the presence of others nearby. The population was quietly falling apart not because life had stopped, but because the systems that supported long-term survival were no longer being renewed. Strength endured, adaptation endured. What faded was the buffer that had once made endurance reliable, leaving survival dependent on an increasingly narrow path that could still be walked but no longer easily widened. The lives of the last mammoths unfolded without any sense of finality, because there was no signal in their world that marked an ending. Animals do not carry awareness of extinction as a concept. They respond to weather, to hunger, to the presence or absence of others, and to the rhythms that guide daily survival. For the mammoths, those rhythms were still intact. Grass continued to grow in the short summers. Snow returned in familiar cycles. Calves were born, learned to stand, followed their mothers, and grew into the slow confidence of adulthood. There is no evidence in bones, landscapes, or genetic records that mammoths altered their behavior in response to their dwindling numbers. They did not gather differently, abandon routines, or show signs of collective distress beyond what any herd might experience during difficult seasons. From within their own experience, life still made sense. The world remained readable, paths were remembered, shelter was known. The future, as animals understand it, extended no further than the next season and the care of the young. Social structures persisted with quiet resilience. Herds continued to organize themselves around age and experience, with elders guiding movement and younger members learning through observation and repetition. These structures were not fragile traditions that collapsed under pressure. They were deeply embedded behaviors shaped over countless generations. Even as populations shrank, the relationships within them remained stable. Mothers cared for calves. Groups responded to danger together. Individuals recognized one another through sound, scent, and proximity. Communication continued in low vibrations that carried across open ground, connecting members even when distance or weather interfered with sight. Nothing in these interactions suggested a species unraveling. They reflected continuity, the maintenance of order in a familiar form. If mammoths sensed change, it would have been no different from other hardships they had survived many times before. A harsher winter, a poorer growing season, a smaller group than remembered. These were challenges that fell within their understanding of the world, not signals that the world itself was nearing an end. Daily life proceeded as usual because there was no immediate reason for it to do otherwise. Mammoths did not stop grazing or moving because their numbers were lower. Survival is not negotiated through long term planning, it is enacted moment by moment. An individual mammoth's world consisted of food beneath its feet, the presence of others nearby, and the demands of the present season. The gradual losses, unfolding over centuries, were not perceptible in a single lifetime. Each generation inherited a world that still functioned. Even as resilience weakened beneath the surface, the visible environment continued to support ordinary behavior. There were still places to rest, still routes to follow, still times of abundance and times of restraint. From the mammoth's perspective, life did not feel like a long descent. It felt like continuity, punctuated by difficulties that were familiar rather than novel. This absence of awareness is one of the most striking elements of their story. Extinction is often imagined as a dramatic process marked by fear or struggle, yet for mammoths, it unfolded as quiet normalcy extended into narrowing margins. They did not behave as if something irreversible was happening, because nothing in their immediate experience demanded such a response. The slow pace of their disappearance allowed behavior to remain unchanged even as the underlying conditions supporting it eroded. Stability in action can coexist with instability in outcome. The mammoths lived out their lives guided by instincts and learned behavior that had worked for millennia, unaware that the balance those behaviors depended on was failing at a scale beyond perception. This does not mean their lives were empty or diminished. On the contrary, their days were filled with the same richness that had always defined them: movement through open land, care between individuals, knowledge passed quietly from elder to calf. The lack of awareness did not rob their existence of meaning. It simply underscores how extinction operates outside the experience of those living through it. The end does not always arrive as an event. Sometimes it arrives as the final repetition of ordinary life, the last season unfolding like all the others, unnoticed as the last because it felt no different from the ones before it. The world that shaped the mammoths was not defined by ice alone, but by openness, breadth, and remarkable consistency. Across vast stretches of the northern continents, an environment known as the Mammoth Steppe extended from Western Europe through Siberia and into North America, forming one of the largest connected ecosystems the Earth has ever known. It was a land dominated not by trees, but by grasses, herbs, and low flowering plants that thrived in cold, dry conditions. Snow tended to be light and windblown rather than deep and suffocating, allowing grazing animals to reach food even in winter. Summers arrived briefly but with intensity, bathing the land in long daylight that fueled rapid plant growth. This rhythm repeated year after year with only gradual variation, creating a landscape that rewarded endurance and memory. Mammoths were shaped within this stability. Their bodies matched the demands of a world where food was spread across open ground, where long distance movement was part of survival, and where seasonal predictability mattered more than sudden abundance. The mammoth steppe was not gentle, but it was reliable. Cold returned each year, plants returned each year. Pathways across the land remained usable across generations, allowing life to settle into patterns refined slowly rather than reinvented constantly. These grasslands stretched across continents without the sharp boundaries common today. Where modern ecosystems are often fragmented by forests, wetlands, or mountains, the Ice Age grasslands formed a continuous fabric that connected distant regions into a single living system. Mammoths could travel enormous distances over the course of their lives, following familiar gradients of temperature and growth, never encountering a sudden ecological wall. This openness supported not only mammoths, but entire communities of large animals adapted to grazing and movement, from woolly rhinoceroses to steppe bison and wild horses. Predators, too, were shaped by this system, their hunting strategies tuned to wide sightlines and endurance rather than ambush. The land itself acted as a stabilizing force. Grasses returned quickly after disturbance. Soil remained anchored by roots. Nutrients cycled efficiently through large herbivores, whose movement and waste fertilized the ground. In this way, the ecosystem supported giants not as anomalies, but as integral parts of its function. Size was not a liability here, it was an advantage, allowing animals to store energy, retain heat, and travel long distances without constant feeding. What made this world especially supportive was its long term stability. Over thousands of years, conditions changed slowly enough for life to adjust without urgency. Mammoths did not need to reinvent themselves each generation. Their design was honed across deep time to meet consistent demands. Thick fur protected against cold that returned reliably. Large bodies buffered against hunger during lean seasons that followed known rhythms. Social structures evolved around repeated routes and familiar landmarks. Calves born into this world inherited not only genes, but a functioning map of existence. Elders carried knowledge that remained relevant for decades because the landscape itself did not transform abruptly. In this environment, survival favored patience, memory, and cooperation rather than speed or constant innovation. The mammoths were not struggling against their world, they were in quiet alignment with it. This alignment is essential to understanding what came later, because it reveals that mammoths did not evolve for instability. They were creatures of a stable openness that no longer exists. As the Ice Age world gradually gave way to warmer temperatures, rising seas, and spreading forests, the mammoth steppe did not collapse in a single moment. It unraveled. The vast grasslands broke into pieces, and the consistent rhythms that had shaped mammoth life grew less reliable. What once supported giants across continents became confined to scattered pockets, then to isolated refuges. The mammoths themselves did not change quickly because they had never needed to. Their strength lay in a world that moved slowly. When that world disappeared, it was not replaced by another equally stable system for large grazers. The Ice Age world they were built for was gone, not with drama, but with gradual absence, leaving behind bodies perfectly suited to a place that no longer fully existed. The climate that followed the long Ice Age did not simply warm in a gentle, familiar way. It shifted its behavior, breaking patterns that had held steady for thousands of years and replacing them with change that arrived faster than memory could track. After the last glacial maximum, temperatures began to rise not just gradually, but unevenly, surging forward in pulses that reshaped regions within a few generations. Winters grew shorter, summers longer, and the balance between cold and warmth lost its old rhythm. For mammoths, whose bodies and behaviors were tuned to predictable cycles, this was not an immediate disaster. Cold still existed, snow still fell, and seasons still turned. But the rules governing how long each season lasted and how reliably it returned were no longer consistent. What had once been a stable calendar, written into the land itself, began to blur, and the mammoths were living inside a system that no longer repeated itself cleanly. One of the most significant changes unfolded quietly through the movement of plants. As temperatures rose and moisture patterns shifted, forests began to advance into areas once dominated by grasslands. Trees, slower to establish but persistent once rooted, gradually replaced the open steppe with patches of woodland, shrubs, and uneven terrain. This was not a sudden invasion. It happened tree by tree, decade by decade, as seedlings survived winters that would once have killed them and spread into spaces grasses had long ruled. The mammoth steppe, which depended on dry air, sunlight, and wide exposure to wind, began to fragment. Grasses still grew, but they did so in narrower bands between trees or along exposed ridges. Snow accumulated differently under forest cover, piling deeper and lingering longer, making winter grazing more difficult. What had once been an environment shaped for large grazers was slowly transformed into one that favored animals able to browse, maneuver through dense growth, or adjust diets quickly. Food did not disappear, but it changed character and distribution. Mammoths relied on vast amounts of coarse grasses and herbs, plants that could support their size and digestive systems. As forests expanded, these foods became patchy and seasonal in ways they had not been before. The mammoths adapted at first by doing what they always had, moving toward open areas, following familiar routes, and drawing on stored energy during lean periods. But as climate shifts accelerated, the pace of environmental change began to exceed the pace at which mammoth bodies could adjust. Evolution had shaped them for endurance within stable conditions, not for rapid reinvention. Their teeth, guts, and feeding strategies reflected a world of consistency rather than flux. Even small shifts in plant communities required changes in behavior and physiology that could not occur within a few generations. This growing mismatch did not unfold dramatically. Mammoths did not suddenly starve or vanish when forests advanced. Many continued to survive for long periods in landscapes that were only partially altered, finding enough food to meet daily needs. Yet the margin between survival and stress grew thinner. Seasons that once brought reliable abundance now brought uncertainty. A warm summer might increase plant growth in one place while reducing it in another. A mild winter could allow trees to advance further, while a harsh one could bury remaining grasses under deep snow. These swings mattered more in a fragmented world where options were limited. The mammoths were still strong, still capable, but their strength was increasingly spent reacting rather than thriving. What made this period especially difficult was that the climate no longer followed rules the mammoths had been built to read. For thousands of years, gradual change had allowed bodies and behaviors to stay in alignment with the world. Now, change arrived faster than adaptation could reasonably follow. The mammoths carried the legacy of an older Earth within them, an Earth where grasslands stretched wide, seasons repeated faithfully, and survival depended on patience rather than speed. As that Earth receded, the mammoths were left navigating a landscape that no longer matched their design. The climate did not become hostile in an obvious way. It became unfamiliar, and within that unfamiliarity, life continued, but with increasing effort, as bodies shaped by long stability struggled quietly to keep pace with a world that had begun to move too quickly beneath their feet. The size that had once made mammoths so successful began to carry a different weight as their world changed around them. Large bodies are powerful tools in stable environments. They store heat efficiently, resist hunger longer than smaller forms, and discourage predators through presence alone. For most of their history, this scale worked in the mammoth's favor, allowing them to endure cold, scarcity, and long journeys across open land. But size is never neutral. It shapes how much energy must be gathered, how frequently feeding must succeed, and how forgiving the environment needs to be. As climates shifted and landscapes fractured, the enormous calorie requirements that mammoths had always managed quietly moved to the center of survival. Each individual required vast quantities of plant matter every day, not occasionally, not seasonally, but continually. In the mammoth steppe, this demand was met by wide fields of grasses that returned reliably. In the new world taking shape, food still existed, but it arrived in smaller patches, shorter seasons, and less predictable patterns. Reduced food margins altered survival in subtle but persistent ways. Mammoths had long depended on a buffer between what they needed and what the land provided, a margin wide enough to absorb bad seasons without lasting damage. As grasslands gave way to mixed terrain, that margin narrowed. Feeding remained possible, but success depended more on timing and luck. A late thaw could shorten the growing season. A warmer winter could compact snow differently, burying forage beneath ice rather than leaving it windblown and accessible. In earlier times, such variations were balanced by movement. Herds could shift their range, linger in productive areas, or follow emerging growth across vast distances. Now, with migration routes limited and habitats broken into fragments, mammoths were often forced to remain where they were, even when food was scarce. A body built to store energy could withstand hunger, but it still required eventual replenishment. When lean periods became more frequent, reserves were drawn down more often, leaving less room for error. The challenge was not that mammoths could not find food, it was that they had little flexibility in how much they needed. Smaller animals can survive on modest amounts, switch diets more readily, or reproduce quickly when conditions improve. Mammoths could do none of these easily. Their digestive systems were designed to process huge volumes of coarse vegetation, not to extract maximum nutrition from limited sources. Their size demanded consistency, large meals gathered day after day. As the landscape changed, gathering that consistency became harder. Each missed opportunity mattered more. Each poor season echoed longer into the future, affecting body condition, reproductive success, and calf survival. Over time, size became a liability not through weakness, but through mismatch. The mammoths were not too large in an absolute sense. They were too large for a world that no longer offered scale in return. Their strength depended on abundance stretched across space. When abundance became localized and uneven, their advantages thinned. A large body moves slowly through dense vegetation. It cannot easily exploit scattered resources hidden among trees or under deep snow. The very traits that had protected mammoths for thousands of years now limited their options. They could not shrink themselves. They could not quickly alter feeding strategies encoded in anatomy shaped by deep time. Adaptation, when it comes, moves at the pace of generations, and the mammoth's long lives slowed that process further. This did not lead to immediate collapse. Mammoths continued to live full lives, raising young and reaching old age. Their size still offered benefits, especially in colder regions where heat retention and fat storage remained valuable. But the balance had shifted. Size no longer guaranteed resilience. It demanded precision from an environment that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Survival depended less on enduring hardship and more on avoiding it altogether, and avoidance was difficult in a world with fewer places to go. In this way, the mammoths carried their history within them. Their bodies told the story of a planet that once rewarded giants, a planet where vastness on land matched vastness in form. As that planet changed, The same size that had been a triumph slowly constrained their future. There was no dramatic turning point, no sudden failure. There was simply a growing tension between what mammoths required and what the earth could provide. Their bodies remained impressive, capable, and strong. Yet strength alone was no longer enough to guarantee survival in a world that had become smaller, more fragmented, and less forgiving to anything that needed so much, so reliably, for so long. The strain placed on mammoth diets did not announce itself loudly, but it left careful marks written into their bodies, especially in teeth and tusks, that recorded daily life with quiet honesty. Teeth, ground down over years of chewing tough grasses and frozen vegetation, began to show subtle changes in wear patterns near the end of the mammoth's history. The surfaces told of harder feeding, more grit, and less ideal plant matter being consumed, signs that food was still present but less abundant or less nutritious than before. Tusks, which grew continuously throughout a mammoth's life, carried their own layered record, much like rings in a tree. Changes in growth rhythm reflected seasons when nutrition was adequate and seasons when it fell short. These records suggest longer periods of stress, years when growth slowed or became uneven, not because food vanished entirely, but because its quality and reliability declined. The mammoths were still eating, still foraging every day, but they were working harder for less return, scraping through winters and spring thaws with narrower margins than their ancestors had known. Seasonal shortages became more pronounced as familiar patterns unraveled. In the Ice Age world, mammoths were shaped for. Lean times existed, but followed predictable timing. Winters were harsh, but summers compensated with explosive growth across wide grasslands. As climates warmed and vegetation shifted, these compensations grew unreliable. Forest expansion changed how snow accumulated and melted, altering when plants became accessible. Some summers arrived early and dry, others late and uneven. The timing of plant growth slipped out of sync with the mammoth's needs. What had once been a dependable sequence, endure winter, recover in summer, store energy for the next cold season, now varied from year to year. Mammoths still prepared their bodies for scarcity, but preparation depended on having enough surplus to store. When summers produced less usable forage, winter arrived with thinner reserves already in place. These seasonal stresses did not necessarily kill animals outright. Instead, they extended periods of strain, leaving mammoths nutritionally taxed for longer stretches of time. As nutritional strain increased, its effects spread quietly through life stages. Adult mammoths could survive extended shortages by drawing on stored fat, but doing so repeatedly came at a cost. Recovery between lean periods became incomplete. Fat layers were rebuilt more slowly, muscle mass recovered less fully, and overall condition trended downward without ever collapsing. Calves were especially sensitive to these changes. Mothers under nutritional stress still gave birth and still cared for their young, but milk quality and quantity depended on the mother's reserves. A calf born after a series of poor seasons faced a more difficult start, even if it survived infancy. Growth rates slowed subtly, extending vulnerability across longer periods of youth. None of this was dramatic enough to break social structures or halt reproduction, but it reduced the population's ability to rebound after hardship. Each difficult season echoed into the next, compounding stress rather than being fully erased by recovery. Tusks and teeth preserved these echoes across decades, revealing not a sudden dietary collapse, but a steady erosion of nutritional reliability. The mammoth's feeding strategy had evolved for abundance spread widely across space. As that abundance fractured, they adapted as best they could by focusing effort where food remained accessible. This often meant feeding longer in one place, wearing teeth faster, and encountering more soil and debris mixed into vegetation. Increased wear shortened the functional lifespan of teeth, especially critical for older individuals whose survival depended on efficient feeding. When tooth wear outpaced replacement late in life, feeding became less effective, reducing intake at a time when reserves were already under strain. In a stable world, this balance had worked. In a stressed world, it tipped earlier and more often. Yet through all this, mammoths did not stop living as mammoths. They did not abandon their diets or radically change behavior. They persisted within narrowing nutritional limits, using every advantage their bodies allowed. The changes recorded in their teeth and tusks do not tell a story of starvation, but of effort. They speak of animals continuing to feed, continuing to survive, while drawing ever closer to the edge of what their environment could supply. Diet under stress did not end their world. It quietly reshaped it, turning feeding from a dependable foundation into a daily negotiation, one that could still succeed, but only by demanding more from bodies already carrying the weight of a changing planet. The strain placed on mammoth diets did not announce itself loudly, but it left careful marks written into their bodies, especially in teeth and tusks, that recorded daily life with quiet honesty. Teeth, ground down over years of chewing tough grasses and frozen vegetation, began to show subtle changes in wear patterns near the end of the mammoth's history. The surfaces told of harder feeding, more grit, and less ideal plant matter being consumed, signs that food was still present but less abundant or less nutritious than before. Tusks, which grew continuously throughout a mammoth's life, carried their own layered record, much like rings in a tree. Changes in growth rhythm reflected seasons when nutrition was adequate and seasons when it fell short. These records suggest longer periods of stress, years when growth slowed or became uneven, not because food vanished entirely, but because its quality and reliability declined. The mammoths were still eating, still foraging every day, but they were working harder for less return, scraping through winters and spring thaws with narrower margins than their ancestors had known. Seasonal shortages became more pronounced as familiar patterns unraveled. In the Ice Age world, mammoths were shaped for. Lean times existed, but followed predictable timing. Winters were harsh, but summers compensated with explosive growth across wide grasslands. As climates warmed and vegetation shifted, these compensations grew unreliable. Forest expansion changed how snow accumulated and melted, altering when plants became accessible. Some summers arrived early and dry, others late and uneven. The timing of plant growth slipped out of sync with the mammoth's needs. What had once been a dependable sequence, endure winter, recover in summer, store energy for the next cold season, now varied from year to year. Mammoths still prepared their bodies for scarcity, but preparation depended on having enough surplus to store. When summers produced less usable forage, winter arrived with thinner reserves already in place. These seasonal stresses did not necessarily kill animals outright. Instead, they extended periods of strain, leaving mammoths nutritionally taxed for longer stretches of time. As nutritional strain increased, its effects spread quietly through life stages. Adult mammoths could survive extended shortages by drawing on stored fat, but doing so repeatedly came at a cost. Recovery between lean periods became incomplete. Fat layers were rebuilt more slowly, muscle mass recovered less fully, and overall condition trended downward without ever collapsing. Calves were especially sensitive to these changes. Mothers under nutritional stress still gave birth and still cared for their young, but milk quality and quantity depended on the mother's reserves. A calf born after a series of poor seasons faced a more difficult start, even if it survived infancy. Growth rates slowed subtly, extending vulnerability across longer periods of youth. None of this was dramatic enough to break social structures or halt reproduction, but it reduced the population's ability to rebound after hardship. Each difficult season echoed into the next, compounding stress rather than being fully erased by recovery. Tusks and teeth preserved these echoes across decades, revealing not a sudden dietary collapse, but a steady erosion of nutritional reliability. The mammoth's feeding strategy had evolved for abundance spread widely across space. As that abundance fractured, they adapted as best they could by focusing effort where food remained accessible. This often meant feeding longer in one place, wearing teeth faster, and encountering more soil and debris mixed into vegetation. Increased wear shortened the functional lifespan of teeth, especially critical for older individuals whose survival depended on efficient feeding. When tooth wear outpaced replacement late in life, feeding became less effective, reducing intake at a time when reserves were already under strain. In a stable world, this balance had worked. In a stressed world, it tipped earlier and more often. Yet through all this, mammoths did not stop living as mammoths. They did not abandon their diets or radically change behavior. They persisted within narrowing nutritional limits, using every advantage their bodies allowed. The changes recorded in their teeth and tusks do not tell a story of starvation, but of effort. They speak of animals continuing to feed, continuing to survive, while drawing ever closer to the edge of what their environment could supply. Diet under stress did not end their world. It quietly reshaped it, turning feeding from a dependable foundation into a daily negotiation, one that could still succeed, but only by demanding more from bodies already carrying the weight of a changing planet. Humans entered the mammoth world gradually, not as a sudden force arriving all at once, but as a spreading presence moving along the edges of familiar landscapes. Long before mammoths reached their final refuges, human groups had already begun expanding across northern continents, following rivers, coastlines, and seasonal resources with patience shaped by experience rather than speed. This expansion unfolded over thousands of years, slow enough that it did not immediately disrupt the rhythms of large animals built for endurance. At first, humans and mammoths simply shared space. They occupied overlapping worlds without constant contact, both shaped by the same broad environments: cold plains, open ground, and shifting seasons. Humans adapted quickly to new regions, using tools, fire, and social cooperation to exploit a wide range of resources, but this flexibility did not translate into instant dominance over every species they encountered. Mammoths were large, cautious, and formidable, and for a long time, human presence added complexity to the landscape rather than erasing it. Archaeological evidence shows that humans and mammoths coexisted across wide regions for millennia. Sites scattered across Eurasia and North America preserve traces of both, sometimes in close proximity, sometimes layered through time in ways that show repeated encounters rather than brief overlap. Mammoth bones, bearing marks of human tools, reveal that hunting did occur, but these traces are sparse compared to the vast span of time both species shared the land. More often, remains suggest scavenging, the careful use of animals already dead, or limited hunting focused on opportunity rather than routine. Humans used mammoths not only for meat, but for bone, tusk, and hide, incorporating them into shelter, tools, and symbolic expression. These interactions speak of familiarity rather than frenzy. Mammoths were part of the world humans moved through, not an enemy to be wiped away, but a presence to be respected, used carefully, and sometimes avoided. This long coexistence is crucial for understanding what humans represented to mammoths. They were not an extinction switch. They were an added pressure layered onto an already changing world. Human hunting alone did not drive mammoths to disappearance, as evidenced by how long mammoths persisted alongside human populations. Even as humans spread, mammoths survived across vast territories, retreating gradually into regions where climate, geography, and isolation provided temporary balance. What humans brought with them was not simply predation, but disturbance. Fire altered vegetation, camps and movement patterns reshaped local ecosystems. Human competition affected other species that mammoths depended on indirectly. These changes accumulated quietly, interacting with climate shifts, habitat fragmentation, and nutritional stress rather than acting independently. For mammoths, the presence of humans likely registered as another unpredictable element in an already complex environment. A herd might avoid certain valleys after repeated encounters, or shift movement patterns subtly without abandoning established routes altogether. These adjustments were well within the mammoth's capacity. They had lived alongside predators for their entire history. Humans were different in behavior, but they were not immediately overwhelming. The challenge arose from timing. Humans arrived during a period when mammoths were already operating near their limits, constrained by shrinking habitats, unstable weather, and reduced genetic resilience. In such conditions, even modest additional pressure carried weight. Losses that might once have been absorbed became more consequential when recovery margins were thin. Importantly, the archaeological record does not show a sudden collapse tied neatly to human arrival. Instead, it reflects a long, uneven process in which mammoths and humans shared the planet without dramatic confrontation. Mammoths continued to reproduce, migrate within limited ranges, and maintain social structures long after humans appeared. Their decline does not match the pattern of rapid overhunting. It matches accumulation. Humans did not end the mammoths with a single act. They participated unknowingly in a slow narrowing of options, contributing stress rather than delivering a final blow. In this way, humans entered the mammoth world as part of a larger story rather than as its conclusion. They moved into landscapes already in flux, carrying tools and adaptability that allowed them to thrive where mammoths endured. The mammoths did not vanish upon contact. They lived alongside people, shared space, and continued their lives much as they had before. Human presence mattered, but it mattered most because it arrived at a time when endurance alone was no longer enough to guarantee survival, adding one more quiet pressure to a system that had already begun to lose its balance. The evidence left behind by both mammoths and humans tells a restrained story, one that resists easy conclusions and demands patience to understand. While signs of hunting do exist, cut marks on bones, broken tusks shaped into tools, clusters of remains near ancient camps, they appear sporadically rather than constantly, scattered across vast stretches of time and space. These traces show that humans were capable of hunting mammoths, but not that they did so relentlessly or universally. In many regions where humans and mammoths coexisted, mammoth populations endured for thousands of years without collapsing. Even as human technologies improved and populations slowly expanded, this persistence matters. It suggests that hunting pressure, while real, was limited by difficulty, danger, and circumstance. Mammoths were enormous, resilient, and social animals. Bringing one down required coordination, favorable terrain, and considerable risk. success would have been significant but rare. For much of their shared history, mammoths were not an easily exploited resource, but an occasional opportunity, taken when conditions allowed and avoided when they did not. The long survival of mammoths alongside humans reinforces this picture. If hunting alone had been decisive, mammoths would have vanished rapidly wherever people arrived. Instead, they continued to occupy wide regions long after human presence became established. They adapted their movements, shifted habitats where possible, and maintained reproductive cycles across centuries. This endurance shows that mammoths were not overwhelmed by human predation in isolation. Their bodies, behaviors, and social structures were sufficient to withstand limited losses when the surrounding environment still offered recovery. A hunted animal could be replaced when food was abundant, migration routes remained open, and populations were large enough to absorb impact. For millennia, these conditions held often enough for mammoths to persist. Humans, in this context, were part of the ecological fabric rather than a singular destructive force. The problem emerges when hunting is viewed without context. By focusing narrowly on human impact, it becomes easy to overlook how many other pressures were already reshaping mammoth lives. Climate instability, habitat fragmentation, nutritional strain, and genetic isolation were quietly narrowing survival margins long before the last mammoths disappeared. When these stresses combined, even small additional losses mattered more than they once had. A mammoth killed by humans during a period of abundance might have had little lasting effect. The same loss during a time of scarcity, isolation, or poor reproduction carried greater weight. Hunting did not need to intensify dramatically to become more consequential. Its impact increased because the system around it was weakening. Oversimplified blame flattens this complexity into a single cause, offering clarity at the expense of accuracy. It replaces a layered story with a clean ending, comforting in its simplicity but misleading in its conclusions. The disappearance of mammoths was not the result of one force acting decisively, but of multiple pressures converging slowly, sometimes invisibly. Hunting participated in this convergence without defining it entirely. To blame humans alone is to ignore the role of climate shifts that altered food and weather, the geographic isolation that limited recovery, and the biological constraints that slowed adaptation. These elements did not operate independently. They interacted, amplifying one another in ways that only become visible when examined together. Understanding this matters beyond the mammoths themselves. It reshapes how extinction is understood more broadly, not as a sudden event triggered by a single cause, but as a long process shaped by accumulation. Mammoths survived humans for millennia because survival depends on systems, not moments. As long as enough of the system remained intact, mammoths endured. When that system frayed beyond a certain point, losses that had once been manageable became final. The end did not arrive because hunting suddenly increased or because one bad winter struck. It arrived because recovery no longer followed loss. This perspective does not remove responsibility or diminish human influence. Instead, it places that influence where it belongs, within a wider web of change. Humans altered landscapes, competed for resources, and occasionally hunted mammoths. These actions mattered, especially as other pressures mounted. But they did not operate in isolation, and they did not dictate outcomes alone. By resisting the urge to assign a single cause, the story of the mammoths becomes quieter, more intricate, and more honest. It reveals extinction not as a moment of violence, but as the gradual exhaustion of possibilities, where no single factor dominates, and where life continues until it no longer can. Even when no one action feels decisive on its own. Life on an island follows different rules, not because the land is harsher, but because it is final. Once mammoths became confined to islands, especially remote Arctic ones, survival shifted into a narrower form that quietly magnified every weakness. On the mainland, populations had once been part of a broad network, with movement and mixing acting as natural repairs to damage caused by loss, disease, or poor seasons. On an island, that network vanished. Space was fixed, borders were absolute, and every individual became part of a closed equation. Island populations collapse faster not because life ends suddenly, but because there are fewer ways to recover from ordinary stress. A dry summer, a difficult winter, or a short run of poor births does not echo outward into a wider system that can compensate. It stays contained, pressing again and again on the same limited group. For mammoths, whose lives had once depended on openness and scale, this confinement altered survival at its most basic level. There was no new land to move into when conditions worsened. There were no neighboring herds to absorb loss or share variation. Each generation inherited not only the island itself, but the accumulated consequences of everything that had already gone wrong. The absence of escape and reinforcement reshaped survival into something quieter and more relentless. On islands, losses are permanent in a way they are not on continents. When an individual dies, it is not replaced by movement from elsewhere. When a calf fails to survive, the absence carries forward without correction. Over time, these small losses turn into attrition, not dramatic decline, but steady thinning. Mammoths continued to live full lives within these constraints. They grazed, moved across familiar ground, and raised young as they always had. Yet the population slowly lost depth. Herds became smaller. Age structure flattened as there were fewer elders and fewer calves to replace them. Knowledge carried by long lived individuals became more fragile because fewer individuals held it. Random events gained power. A storm that killed a handful of animals might once have been absorbed across a wide range. On an island, the same storm altered the future of the entire population. Disease, too, behaved differently in confined spaces. With no incoming diversity, immunity could weaken, and outbreaks carried more weight, even if they were limited. None of this required catastrophe. Survival turned into endurance without replenishment, where each success merely delayed an outcome shaped by mathematics rather than drama. Attrition is difficult to recognize because it looks like life continuing. For the mammoths on islands, there was no moment when survival stopped making sense. Their world remained usable. Food still grew. Seasons still turned. Social structures persisted. Yet survival had become a process of slowly spending what could no longer be renewed. Every generation depended on the same finite resources, the same limited land, the same inherited resilience. Once conditions began to slip, they could not be restored to previous states. Islands do not forgive imbalance easily. They magnify it over time. What began as refuge slowly transformed into constraint, not through threat, but through isolation itself. This is why island extinctions often feel puzzling when viewed only at the end. There is no dramatic cause to point to, no single failure to blame. The collapse happens because survival becomes arithmetic rather than struggle. Each generation starts with slightly less than the one before, even if daily life appears unchanged. Mammoths did not fail to adapt on islands. They adapted as much as their biology allowed. What they could not do was escape the limits of enclosure. The island effect does not rush extinction. It makes it unavoidable once decline begins. With no reinforcement and no retreat, Endurance slowly becomes expenditure, and life continues until the balance quietly reaches zero, not with an ending anyone could witness, but with a population that simply, gently runs out. When populations shrink to small numbers, the world begins to operate by different rules, not because the environment suddenly grows harsher, but because chance gains influence it never had before. In large populations, random events are absorbed, diluted across many individuals and many seasons. Disease may take some, but others resist. A poor breeding year may slow growth, but numbers recover when conditions improve. An extreme winter may claim the vulnerable, but survivors carry the population forward. For the last mammoths, this buffering capacity had faded. With fewer individuals spread across limited ground, randomness no longer scattered its effects. It struck directly and stayed within the system. Disease became more dangerous not because pathogens were new or unusually strong, but because there were fewer immune responses available to counter them. In a small population, even a mild illness could move through closely connected individuals, encountering little resistance and leaving lasting absence behind. There were no distant herds to reintroduce variation or resilience. Each loss remained present in every subsequent generation, narrowing options quietly but permanently. Bad breeding years carried similar weight. Mammoths had always reproduced slowly, investing heavily in each calf and spacing births across long intervals. This strategy worked when populations were large and stable, allowing occasional failures to be offset by success elsewhere. In small populations, a single poor reproductive season could echo for decades. A warm year that disrupted plant growth, a winter that drained maternal reserves, or a string of births skewed toward one sex could all reduce the number of surviving calves. These outcomes were not unusual in themselves. What changed was scale. When numbers were already low, missing a generation of calves meant losing future adults before they ever existed. Recovery slowed not because mammoths forgot how to reproduce, but because opportunity disappeared. Each calf carried more of the population's future than ever before, and when chance intervened, it took disproportionate weight with it. Extreme winters, once survivable challenges, also became decisive. Mammoths were adapted to cold, but not all cold behaves the same way. Some winters arrived with deeper snow, others with ice locked hard over the ground after sudden thaws. In earlier times, herds could shift location, spread out, or rely on sheer numbers to ensure that enough survived. In small populations confined to limited spaces, these options vanished. An especially harsh winter could remove a significant portion of the remaining animals simply by exhausting their reserves beyond recovery. Survival depended not only on strength, but on timing, snow conditions, and access to food. When those aligned poorly, losses were unavoidable. And unlike in the past, there was no demographic cushion left to absorb them. What makes this phase of the mammoth story so quiet is that nothing dramatic needed to happen for extinction to advance. No single disease outbreak had to be catastrophic. No winter had to be unprecedented. No breeding season had to fail completely. It was the accumulation of ordinary misfortune within an extraordinarily small population that proved decisive. Chance became fatal not because it grew more aggressive, but because there was no longer enough life to buffer its effects. The line between survival and disappearance narrowed to the point where random variation alone could decide outcomes. In such systems, extinction does not require intent, pressure, or escalation. It requires only time. From within the mammoth's experience, these events would have felt familiar. Illness, failed births, and harsh winters were part of their evolutionary history. They had survived all of them before. What they could not sense was the changed context in which those events occurred. When numbers were large, adversity was followed by renewal. When numbers were small, adversity became subtraction without replacement. The mammoths continued to live according to instincts shaped for abundance and openness, unaware that the arithmetic governing their survival had shifted. Each generation moved forward assuming recovery would follow loss, because that had always been true. But in a population reduced to a fragile handful, recovery depended increasingly on luck rather than resilience. This is how chance becomes destiny without spectacle. Extinction arrives not as a final blow, but as the point where variability outruns the capacity to recover. The mammoths did not fall because the world turned against them in a single moment. They faded because small numbers transformed randomness into force. Disease, weather, and reproduction, once manageable parts of life, became decisive simply by acting as they always had. When populations shrink far enough, even a gentle world can become lethal, not through cruelty or intention, but through ordinary events landing on a system no longer able to withstand them. The last generations of mammoths entered a world that still looked familiar, yet felt subtly altered in ways that shaped their lives from the first days they stood on trembling legs. Calves were still born into herds, greeted by low calls and the protective circle of adults, but those circles were smaller than they had been before. Where once a calf might have grown, surrounded by dozens of relatives spread across wide ground, now the herd held fewer bodies, fewer overlapping presences, fewer layers of protection. This did not change the warmth of care or the strength of bonds, but it changed the scale of experience. A smaller herd meant fewer companions to learn from and fewer individuals to share the demands of travel and feeding. Each calf carried more weight simply by existing, because each birth mattered more than ever. Mothers invested the same devotion, but they did so within a thinner margin of safety, where illness or poor seasons pressed harder and recovery took longer. Life continued, but it unfolded within tighter limits, where every individual shaped the future more directly than in the past. As herds grew smaller, elders became rarer. Mammoths had always depended on long-lived individuals to guide movement, remember distant feeding grounds, and recognize subtle signals in weather and land. Elders were living maps, carrying decades of experience that turned uncertainty into familiarity. In the last generations, fewer mammoths reached such ages, not because they forgot how to live long lives, but because accumulating pressures made longevity harder to achieve. Each elder lost represented more than one individual. It represented the fading of memory that could not be replaced quickly. Younger adults still led, but leadership without deep memory is different. It relies more on immediate cues than long patterns. Routes that once extended far into the landscape now covered less ground. Timing decisions relied on shorter histories. The herd still functioned, but it did so with less stored knowledge, adapting to the present rather than drawing strength from a remembered past. The loss of accumulated knowledge reshaped survival quietly but profoundly. Mammoths did not teach through instruction, but through presence and repetition. Calves learned by following elders across terrain, by sensing when to move and when to wait, by absorbing patterns repeated year after year. When elders were few, that transfer narrowed. Certain routes were no longer used, not because they were no longer valuable, but because no one remembered them well enough to choose them with confidence. Strategies that had once been passed across generations faded simply because there were fewer opportunities to demonstrate them. The herd's understanding of the land became more immediate, focused on what was nearby and familiar, rather than what lay farther away or had worked long ago under different conditions. These changes did not cause confusion or visible distress. Mammoths remained competent, aware animals, capable of responding to their surroundings. But competence without depth is more vulnerable to disruption. When unusual weather arrived or food patterns shifted, the reduced pool of experience limited how many responses were available. Decisions were still made, but fewer options stood behind them. Over time, this meant that herds became more reactive and less anticipatory, responding to challenges as they appeared, rather than avoiding them through remembered caution. The difference was subtle, almost invisible in the moment, but meaningful across years. For calves growing up in these smaller herds, the world felt complete because it was all they knew. They did not sense that something had been lost. They learned the rhythms they were shown and moved through a landscape defined by present experience, yet their inheritance was narrower. They received care, but from fewer adults. They received guidance, but from shorter memories. They entered adulthood, equipped for the world as it existed then, not for the wider possibilities that had shaped their ancestors. This narrowing of knowledge did not end life. It changed how life adapted. The last generations lived normally by every outward measure. They fed, traveled, socialized, and reproduced within the limits they had. Their days were not marked by endings, but by continuity, even as continuity itself grew thinner. The disappearance of elders and the quiet loss of shared memory did not announce extinction. They simply reduced the tools available to withstand change. In this way, the end approached not as a dramatic failure, but as a gradual forgetting where the mammoths carried forward everything they still had, unaware that what had been lost was precisely what once allowed them to endure a larger, more forgiving world. The disappearance of the mammoths did not arrive with a single moment that could be pointed to and named. There was no final battle where the last herd fell together, no dramatic struggle that marked an unmistakable end. There was no final storm that swept across the land and erased them in one overwhelming blow. Instead, extinction unfolded as absence accumulating quietly over time. One season ended with slightly fewer animals than before. The next generation began with a smaller herd than the one remembered. Life continued in familiar ways, but the count of living bodies slowly declined, not through catastrophe, but through repetition. Each loss seemed ordinary when it happened, a death that made sense within the rhythms of a challenging world. What made extinction invisible was that nothing about any single moment demanded recognition as the moment. For the mammoths themselves, there was no signal that something irreversible was underway. Herds still formed, calves were still born and guided across the land. The landscape still offered food, shelter, and space to move. When an individual died, the herd adjusted as it always had. Others filled the space. Paths were still followed. Memory still guided movement. Extinction did not announce itself as an event because it was not experienced as one. It was experienced as continuity that became thinner with each repetition. The difference between survival and disappearance was not measured in days or years, but in how many times life could repeat itself before it no longer did. Without a final battle, there was also no final victory or defeat. Nothing was resolved. The mammoths were not overcome by an enemy that could be named or avoided. They were not defeated in a way that could have gone differently if one choice had changed. Their end was not a failure of courage, strength, or adaptability. It was the quiet outcome of living in a world where recovery no longer followed loss. Each generation carried forward fewer individuals, fewer memories, fewer options. Even so, that generation lived normally by its own standards. It grazed, traveled, rested, and endured. The absence of drama is what allowed extinction to proceed unnoticed. Without a final storm, the environment never appeared to turn decisively against them. Weather remained variable, sometimes harsh, sometimes generous. Food remained present, sometimes scarce, sometimes sufficient. There was no clear line where conditions crossed into impossibility. Instead, conditions simply failed to offer enough margin for error often enough. A poor season did not end the population, it left fewer survivors. A harsh winter did not erase the herd, it reduced it. A disease did not wipe them out, it removed some that could not be replaced. The world kept functioning in ways that made sense locally, even as the long term trajectory moved quietly downward. What remained was a simple pattern, repeated gently until it ended. Each generation contained fewer mammoths than the one before. There were fewer calves learning the land, fewer adults carrying strength into the future, fewer elders holding memory. None of this felt like a conclusion at the time. It felt like continuation under constraint. Extinction arrived not as a moment of realization, but as the last repetition that did not repeat again. The final mammoth did not know it was the final one. It lived within a world that still worked, even if that world could no longer support another generation beyond it. This kind of ending resists narrative because it offers no climax. It offers no image of collapse, yet it reveals something essential about how life leaves the earth. Most extinctions do not happen in an instant. They happen when ordinary life becomes slightly less sustainable each time it is lived, when births fail to match deaths, when recovery slows just enough to fall behind loss, when the future is no longer replenished, but nothing in the present looks broken. The mammoths did not vanish in a moment, because extinction is not always an event. Sometimes it is a condition, the slow narrowing of possibility until there is no room left for another beginning. The world did not change overnight. It continued on, seasons turning, winds moving across grass and snow long after the mammoths were gone. What changed was simply who was no longer there. And because there was no final battle or storm, the end passed without witnesses, leaving behind a silence that was not sudden but complete. The final mammoths of Wrangel Island lived far closer to the present than anyone once imagined, their existence revealed not by stories or memory, but by careful dating of bones, tusks, and teeth preserved in Arctic ground. These remains place the last confirmed mammoths only a few thousand years ago, long after ice sheets had retreated and long after human societies elsewhere had begun to settle, build, and record their lives. On this small island at the edge of the Arctic Ocean, mammoths were still walking, feeding, and reproducing while the wider world moved on without them. There was nothing ancient about their daily lives from their own perspective. Seasons still arrived, grass still grew, calves were still born into living herds. The dates do not describe a population barely clinging to survival. They describe a species that remained present and functioning until very near the end. Life on Wrangel Island at that time was quiet and constrained, but it was not chaotic. The mammoths that lived there inhabited a landscape they knew entirely, one without migration routes or distant horizons, but familiar down to its smallest details. They would have followed repeated paths across tundra and low hills, returning to the same feeding areas year after year, guided by memory rather than exploration. The climate was cold, but manageable for bodies built to retain heat. Food was limited, but sufficient most years to support continued life. Herds were small, yet structured, composed of individuals that recognized one another and maintained social bonds. There was no reason for a mammoth living on Wrangel Island to believe its world was ending. Everything required for ordinary existence was still present. The genetic and physical evidence suggests that these mammoths were not severely impaired or visibly failing as animals. They continued to grow, reach maturity, and reproduce. Calves survived to adulthood. Adults lived for many years. The species was diminished in number, but not broken in form or function. Even with reduced genetic diversity and accumulated stress, they remained mammoths in every meaningful sense. Their bodies still carried thick fur and fat. Their tusks still grew and wore down through daily use. Their teeth still ground vegetation season after season. From the outside, their lives would have looked much like mammoth lives had looked for thousands of years before. This is what makes their ending so difficult to pinpoint. There is no clear transition from living species to extinct one. There is only a final stretch where life continues normally until it does not. At some point, quietly and without record, reproduction stopped. Perhaps a final calf was born into a herd too small to sustain future generations. Perhaps a harsh winter, a disease, or a poor sequence of seasons removed just enough individuals to push the balance beyond recovery. Whatever the immediate cause, it did not arrive as a dramatic collapse. The mammoths of Wrangel Island did not disappear in a single year or even a single generation. The species crossed from presence to absence without a defining moment that could be witnessed. One season ended with fewer animals than before. Another began with no new calves. Eventually, there were no mammoths left to continue the pattern. What stands out most is that the mammoths did not become something else before they vanished. They did not degrade into a lesser version of themselves or transform under pressure. They remained what they had always been, animals shaped for a world that no longer fully existed, surviving within a narrow refuge for as long as that refuge could support them. The phrase functioning species until suddenly not is not poetic exaggeration. It reflects what the evidence shows. There was no long visible decline into dysfunction. The system held, and then it failed. Not because life had stopped working, but because it had run out of room to repeat itself again. The final mammoths of Wrangel Island lived without awareness of their place in history. They did not know they were late survivors or final representatives. They lived ordinary days in an extraordinary position, carrying the last expression of a lineage that had once stretched across continents. Their disappearance did not signal itself with noise or disruption. It arrived as silence after continuity, as the end of repetition rather than the end of struggle. And because they vanished in this way, without spectacle or witness, their story remains one of the clearest examples of how extinction can occur not as destruction, but as quiet completion, life continuing faithfully until there is no one left to continue it. The day the mammoths were gone did not announce itself to the planet because there was nothing about it that distinguished it from the countless days before. There was no global signal etched into ice or stone, no sudden shift in climate or chemistry that marked an ending. Earth did not pause. The sun rose and set. Winds moved across tundra and sea. Plants grew and withered according to seasons that had already learned to continue without notice. In one small place, perhaps on Wrangel Island or another isolated refuge, life simply failed to repeat. A year passed without a calf being born. Another passed without any mammoth answering the low calls that once traveled across the ground. The disappearance happened locally, quietly, in a place already distant from most of the world. And because it did, there was no echo large enough to reach beyond it. Extinction arrived not as an event that reshaped systems overnight, but as an absence that only became complete when no living bodies remained to fill it. Nothing new replaced them in that moment. The land did not change color or structure instantly. It only held one presence fewer than before. There were no witnesses, because there was no moment to witness. No human stood watching the last mammoth breathe its last breath. No record carved into stone or written onto bark. Even if someone had been nearby, the scene would have appeared ordinary: an animal growing weak, an animal dying, something that had happened many times before in many places. What separated this death from others was not visible at the time. It was only visible afterward, when days turned into seasons and no mammoths returned. Silence replaced a sound so gradually that it did not feel like loss until it was already complete. The low vibrations that once moved through ground and air faded without ceremony. Trails that had been walked for generations softened and grew over. Feeding grounds remained, unused, slowly reshaped by weather and time. The Earth did not record their absence as catastrophe, because ecosystems often adjust slowly, absorbing change without rupture. The mammoths had shaped their world over immense spans of time, but their removal did not tear it apart instantly. It simply altered it gently, leaving space where a presence had been. Silence, rather than catastrophe, defines this ending. Silence does not shock, it does not demand attention, it settles. The mammoths did not leave behind ruins or scars that announced their disappearance to distant observers. Their bodies returned to soil and ice. Their influence lingered faintly in vegetation patterns and nutrient flows, then faded further as other forces took over. Without a global signal, extinction remained a local truth that never became a planetary event in the moment it occurred. Only much later, through careful study, would humans piece together the realization that a lineage spanning continents and hundreds of thousands of years had ended without sound. This quiet end reflects the nature of their disappearance. Mammoths did not fall to a single cause acting decisively. They reached the end through accumulation, through margins, narrowing until repetition could no longer continue. When repetition stopped, there was nothing dramatic to mark it. Life does not always leave with noise. Sometimes it leaves by failing to return. The day the mammoths were gone was indistinguishable from the day before to everything except history itself, and history does not feel, it only remembers. In this way, the mammoths passed out of the living world without spectacle. Their story closed not with destruction, but with completion, a final, unwitnessed ending that did not alter the rhythm of Earth in any obvious way. The planet carried on, unaware that something ancient had quietly stepped away. What remained was not devastation, but stillness, a silence that slowly grew permanent, marking not a catastrophe, but the simple fact that no mammoths were left to fill the space they once held. When the mammoths were gone, the earth did not pause to acknowledge the change, but it began to adjust in subtle, long-reaching ways. Vegetation responded first, not dramatically, but through gradual shifts in pattern and density. For thousands of years, mammoths had acted as moving forces across the land, grazing heavily, trampling soil, knocking down shrubs, and keeping vast areas open through their daily routines. Without them, grasses that once returned quickly after disturbance began to give way to taller plants, shrubs, and eventually trees in some regions. Areas that had been shaped into open steppe by constant movement slowly grew denser. Snow accumulated differently without large bodies, breaking crusts and compacting surfaces. In some places, deeper snow lingered longer into spring, altering soil moisture and delaying plant growth. The land did not become unrecognizable overnight. It simply grew quieter and less disturbed, allowing vegetation to follow paths it had been held back from for millennia. The loss of megafauna influence extended beyond plants alone. Mammoths had been engineers of their ecosystems, redistributing nutrients through waste, exposing soil through digging and trampling, and creating mosaics of growth that supported a wide range of smaller species. Their absence altered these processes. Nutrients became more locally concentrated rather than spread across long distances. Certain grasses declined without regular grazing, while others expanded unchecked. Insects, birds, and small mammals adapted to these new conditions, sometimes flourishing, sometimes fading, depending on how closely their lives had been tied to the open landscapes mammoths once maintained. Predators that had scavenged mammoth remains or relied indirectly on their presence shifted to other sources. The web of life did not collapse. It rearranged itself, quietly rebalancing around a new center of gravity. Ecosystems are resilient, but they are not static. Without mammoths, the Earth began to favor different relationships. Forests advanced into areas once kept open by grazing. Wetlands expanded in places where soil compaction had changed. Fire patterns altered as vegetation density increased, sometimes burning hotter or spreading differently than before. These changes unfolded over centuries, slow enough to feel natural, yet significant enough to reshape entire regions over time. What vanished was not just an animal, but a way the land interacted with large moving bodies. The Earth continued to function, but with fewer forces acting upon it, its expression softened and shifted. This reshaping did not mean improvement or decline in any simple sense. It meant transformation. Some ecosystems became more wooded and enclosed. Others lost diversity tied to open ground. The presence of mammoths had favored vastness, openness, and movement. Their absence favored stillness and enclosure. Neither state was inherently better. They were different responses to different conditions. Life adjusted as it always does, filling available space, responding to new pressures, forming new balances. The mammoths were no longer part of that negotiation, but their long influence lingered in soil layers, plant communities, and the shape of landscapes that still bore traces of their passage. Over long spans of time, the earth forgot the mammoths in the way it forgets most things, not by erasing every trace, but by incorporating change into its ongoing processes. Their disappearance became part of the background conditions future life adapted to. New species evolved without ever encountering the heavy tread of giant grazers. Human societies expanded into landscapes already altered by their absence, often unaware that what felt like untouched wilderness had once been shaped by immense animals moving through it daily. The silence left behind became normal. In this way, the earth changed without mourning. It did not mark the loss as a rupture, it simply adjusted, turning absence into structure and memory into geology. The mammoths did not leave a void that remained empty. They left a space that life slowly reoccupied in different forms. What remains today is not devastation, but a transformed world, one that carries the imprint of giants who once walked it, even as it continues forward without them, reshaping itself gently around the absence they left behind. When the mammoths were gone, the earth did not pause to acknowledge the change, but it began to adjust in subtle, long-reaching ways. Vegetation responded first, not dramatically, but through gradual shifts in pattern and density. For thousands of years, mammoths had acted as moving forces across the land, grazing heavily, trampling soil, knocking down shrubs, and keeping vast areas open through their daily routines. Without them, Grasses that once returned quickly after disturbance began to give way to taller plants, shrubs, and eventually trees in some regions. Areas that had been shaped into open steppe by constant movement slowly grew denser. Snow accumulated differently without large bodies, breaking crusts and compacting surfaces. In some places, deeper snow lingered longer into spring, altering soil moisture and delaying plant growth. The land did not become unrecognizable overnight. It simply grew quieter and less disturbed, allowing vegetation to follow paths it had been held back from for millennia. The loss of megafauna influence extended beyond plants alone. Mammoths had been engineers of their ecosystems, redistributing nutrients through waste, exposing soil through digging and trampling, and creating mosaics of growth that supported a wide range of smaller species. Their absence altered these processes. Nutrients became more locally concentrated rather than spread across long distances. Certain grasses declined without regular grazing, while others expanded unchecked. Insects, birds, and small mammals adapted to these new conditions, sometimes flourishing, sometimes fading, depending on how closely their lives had been tied to the open landscapes mammoths once maintained. Predators that had scavenged mammoth remains or relied indirectly on their presence shifted to other sources. The web of life did not collapse. It rearranged itself, quietly rebalancing around a new center of gravity. Ecosystems are resilient, but they are not static. Without mammoths, the earth began to favor different relationships. Forests advanced into areas once kept open by grazing. Wetlands expanded in places where soil compaction had changed. Fire patterns altered as vegetation density increased, sometimes burning hotter or spreading differently than before. These changes unfolded over centuries, slow enough to feel natural, yet significant enough to reshape entire regions over time. What vanished was not just an animal, but a way the land interacted with large moving bodies. The earth continued to function, but with fewer forces acting upon it, its expression softened and shifted. This reshaping did not mean improvement or decline in any simple sense. It meant transformation. Some ecosystems became more wooded and enclosed. Others lost diversity tied to open ground. The presence of mammoths had favored vastness, openness, and movement. Their absence favored stillness and enclosure. Neither state was inherently better. They were different responses to different conditions. Life adjusted as it always does, filling available space, responding to new pressures, forming new balances. The mammoths were no longer part of that negotiation, but their long influence lingered in soil layers, plant communities, and the shape of landscapes that still bore traces of their passage. Over long spans of time, the earth forgot the mammoths in the way it forgets most things, not by erasing every trace, but by incorporating change into its ongoing processes. Their disappearance became part of the background conditions future life adapted to. New species evolved without ever encountering the heavy tread of giant grazers. Human societies expanded into landscapes already altered by their absence, often unaware that what felt like untouched wilderness had once been shaped by immense animals moving through it daily. The silence left behind became normal. In this way, the earth changed without mourning. It did not mark the loss as a rupture, it simply adjusted, turning absence into structure and memory into geology. The mammoths did not leave a void that remained empty. They left a space that life slowly reoccupied in different forms. What remains today is not devastation, but a transformed world, one that carries the imprint of giants who once walked it, even as it continues forward without them, reshaping itself gently around the absence they left behind. The story of the mammoths does not stand alone. Across the Ice Age world, many other giants followed remarkably similar paths, shaped by the same balance of endurance, stability, and slow change, then undone by the same quiet accumulation of pressures. Woolly rhinoceroses once grazed alongside mammoths on open steppe, their massive bodies and thick hides built for cold and consistency. Giant ground sloths moved deliberately through the Americas, adapted to landscapes where time and space allowed slow lives to flourish. Mastodons browsed forests and wetlands with bodies designed for abundance spread over wide ground. Even the great Irish elk, with antlers spanning vast distances, depended on stable environments that could sustain their size and specialization. These animals differed in shape, diet, and behavior, yet their histories converged in a shared pattern. They thrived when ecosystems remained predictable and expansive. They persisted through hardship when recovery followed stress, and they declined when those conditions no longer held, not suddenly, but through gradual narrowing of possibility that mirrored the mammoth's experience. The extinction patterns seen across these species reveal striking similarities. Most did not vanish at the height of glacial cold, but after climates began to warm and fragment landscapes, many survived for thousands of years alongside humans, sometimes in reduced numbers, sometimes retreating into refuges, but rarely disappearing immediately upon contact. Fossil and genetic evidence shows long periods of overlap, adaptation, and persistence rather than instant collapse. Their declines often unfolded unevenly across regions, with island or isolated populations lasting longer while mainland populations faded earlier. Small numbers, slow reproduction, and specialization made recovery difficult once losses accumulated. Like mammoths, these giants were not undone by a single cause. Climate shifts altered food and habitat. Human pressures added disturbance and occasional hunting. Genetic diversity narrowed as populations shrank. Weather grew less predictable. Each factor alone was survivable. Together, they reshaped survival into attrition. The shared pattern is not one of dramatic endings, but of long survival followed by quiet disappearance, life continuing faithfully until it could not continue again. Seen at a global scale, these parallel stories point toward a broader biological trend. Large animals with long lifespans and slow reproduction are exceptionally good at surviving stable worlds. They store energy, weather scarcity, and carry knowledge across generations. But these same traits limit how quickly they can respond when conditions change rapidly and unevenly. During the Ice Age, Earth supported many giants because its systems moved slowly enough for those traits to remain advantages. As the planet transitioned out of that state, the biological contract shifted. Speed began to matter more than endurance. Flexibility began to matter more than specialization. Smaller, faster reproducing species could adapt more readily to fragmented habitats and unstable climates. Giants could persist for a time, often impressively so, but persistence is not the same as resilience when change accelerates beyond evolutionary pace. The decline of Ice Age megafauna was not a series of isolated tragedies. It was a coordinated response of life to a planet changing its rules. This global pattern also explains why extinctions clustered in time without being identical in cause or timing. Different regions experienced warming, human arrival, and ecological change in different sequences, yet the outcomes converged. Where landscapes fractured and pressures accumulated faster than recovery, giants faded. Where refuges remained longer, survival extended. The underlying biology was the same. Large bodies, slow life histories, and deep specialization carried immense strength in one context and profound vulnerability in another. The mammoths represent one of the last chapters in this wider transformation, not because they were unique, but because they endured longer than most, reaching almost into recorded human history. Taken together, these stories suggest that extinction on a planetary scale does not require catastrophe to be widespread. It can emerge as a statistical outcome when many species share the same constraints and face the same accelerating changes. The Ice Age giants were not weak or poorly adapted, they were exquisitely tuned to a world that had favored stability for tens of thousands of years. When that world shifted, their shared design became a common liability. The mammoth's path, traced in detail, helps illuminate the quieter truth behind the disappearance of so many giants that extinction can unfold as a global biological trend, shaped not by failure, but by timing, as life built for patience encounters a planet that no longer waits. Extinction did not arrive for the mammoths as a single force pressing from one direction, but as a slow convergence of pressures that accumulated quietly until survival could no longer be sustained. Climate was the first layer, reshaping the world mammoths had been built for. Warming did not erase cold outright, but it rearranged seasons, vegetation, and predictability. Grasslands fragmented, forests advanced, and weather began to behave less reliably. These changes alone were survivable, and for a long time, mammoths proved that by enduring through shifting conditions with strength and patience. Yet climate change set the stage by narrowing margins, turning what had once been dependable recovery into uncertain compensation. Each difficult season carried more weight, not because it was unprecedented, but because it followed others too closely for full recovery to occur. Isolation layered itself on top of this shifting world, as rising seas, advancing forests, and changing terrain broke continuous habitats into smaller pieces. Mammoth populations became separated from one another. Movement that had once repaired losses through mixing and migration no longer functioned as it had. On islands and isolated mainland pockets, mammoths continued to live normally, but they lived within closed systems. There was no reinforcement from outside, no fresh influx of individuals or traits shaped by slightly different conditions. Isolation did not kill mammoths outright. It simply removed the safety net that had once softened the consequences of loss. When numbers dipped, there was no broader population to restore balance. Every death became permanent, every missed birth unrecoverable. Genetics responded to this isolation in predictable but subtle ways. Diversity narrowed as populations shrank and remained cut off. Harmful mutations accumulated slowly, not enough to break bodies or behaviors, but enough to reduce resilience. Mammoths remained functional animals, capable of feeding, reproducing, and surviving harsh conditions. What changed was their ability to absorb surprise. Illness spread more easily through similar immune systems. Rare stresses carried higher cost. Recovery took longer, if it came at all. Genetics did not doom mammoths in isolation. It shaped the background against which other pressures became more effective, quietly thinning the margin between endurance and collapse. Humans entered this already constrained system not as a singular destructive force, but as an additional layer of complexity. People hunted mammoths occasionally, altered landscapes through fire and movement, and competed indirectly for space and resources. These pressures were limited and uneven, as shown by the long coexistence between humans and mammoths across many regions. Mammoths survived humans for thousands of years because the system around them could still absorb loss. As climate instability, isolation, and genetic narrowing compounded, the same human pressures took on greater significance. A mammoth lost to hunting late in the species' history mattered more than one lost earlier, not because hunting had intensified, but because recovery had weakened. Humans did not trigger extinction alone. They participated unknowingly in a process already moving toward its limits. What makes this story difficult to simplify is that none of these forces were fatal by themselves. Climate change did not erase mammoths quickly. Isolation did not stop reproduction outright. Genetic decline did not cause immediate dysfunction. Human presence did not produce sudden collapse. Each pressure was survivable on its own. Mammoths had endured extreme cold, scarcity, predators, and environmental shifts for hundreds of thousands of years. What they had not faced before was the simultaneous accumulation of all these pressures acting together, interacting in ways that amplified their effects. Climate reduced habitat quality and predictability. Isolation prevented recovery. Genetics reduced resilience. Human activity added disturbance and loss at precisely the wrong time. Together, these forces did not crash the system, they slowly exhausted it. Extinction by accumulation does not look dramatic in real time. It looks like life continuing with slightly less flexibility each generation. It looks like recovery arriving later or not fully. It looks like herds growing smaller without disappearing. It looks like adaptation holding just long enough to give the appearance of stability. From within the system, nothing feels final. From outside, compressed into history, the pattern becomes clear. Survival depended on a balance of forces that once favored endurance. When that balance tipped, no single factor pushed mammoths over the edge. They crossed it through persistence stretched too thin. This is why the mammoth's disappearance resists simple explanations. It was not climate alone, or humans alone, or genetics alone. It was the overlap of all four, acting over time rather than through catastrophe. Extinction arrived not as a punishment or a failure, but as the natural outcome of a system carrying too many constraints at once. The mammoths endured until endurance itself was no longer sufficient, and when they finally vanished, it was because everything that had once allowed recovery had quietly been used up, leaving no space left for life to repeat itself again. The most striking detail in the mammoth story is how near they came to lasting just a little longer, how survival narrowed to margins so small that a change measured in centuries rather than millennia could have altered the outcome. For long stretches near the end, mammoths were not failing catastrophically, they were persisting at the edge of balance, where births still roughly matched deaths, where herds still functioned, and where landscapes, though altered, still provided enough to sustain life. Survival did not collapse, it wavered. The difference between continuation and disappearance lay not in dramatic thresholds, but in thin bands of time and condition. A series of slightly better summers, a pause in rapid warming, a few generations with higher calf survival. Any one of these could have kept populations stable for longer. The mammoths lived in this narrow space for centuries, their existence balanced so finely that it depended less on strength than on timing. Those margins were narrow because the pressures acting on mammoths were already crowded together. Climate had shifted, but not beyond endurance. Habitats had fragmented, but not beyond use. Genetic diversity had declined, but not beyond function. Human presence had increased, but not beyond tolerance. Each of these factors hovered just below the level of collapse, creating a system that still worked, but only barely. In such a system, chance and sequence matter enormously. A cold spell arriving after a productive summer could be survived. The same cold spell arriving after a poor one could not. A generation with strong calves could restore momentum. A generation with weak reproduction could erase it. The mammoth's survival became less about adaptation in the long evolutionary sense and more about sequencing, about whether relief followed stress or stress followed stress again. Missed chances were not dramatic turning points. They were quiet moments where the world did not pause long enough for recovery to catch up. Had warming slowed slightly, mammoths might have had time to adjust behaviors and ranges further. Had sea levels stabilized earlier, land connections might have persisted long enough to maintain genetic exchange. Had island populations been reinforced by even a few migrants at the right time, diversity might have been restored just enough to improve resilience. None of these possibilities required reversing history entirely. They required only small differences in timing. The mammoths were not doomed by inevitability. They were undone by the absence of a few favorable sequences that never aligned. Survival hanging by centuries may sound abstract, but in evolutionary terms, it is everything. Centuries are long enough for populations to stabilize, for behavior to shift, for selection to begin favoring slightly different traits. Had mammoths lasted a little longer in greater numbers, they might have crossed into a period where climates settled into new, more predictable patterns. Had they endured until such stability returned, their strengths could once again have been advantages rather than liabilities. The earth does not change smoothly, it pulses and pauses. The mammoths survived through some of those pauses, reaching astonishingly late dates. They simply did not reach one long enough to reset the balance fully. This closeness to survival reshapes how their extinction should be understood. Mammoths did not vanish because they were too inflexible to cope at all. They coped impressively. They adjusted ranges, diets, and behaviors within the limits of their biology. They survived alongside humans for thousands of years. They endured isolation, genetic narrowing, and unpredictable weather far longer than most species could have. The fact that they still disappeared does not point to weakness. It points to how unforgiving timing can be when multiple pressures stack together. Endurance has limits, not because it lacks strength, but because it requires intervals of relief to replenish what stress consumes. In the final accounting, mammoths lived with survival hanging by centuries rather than generations, which is why their story feels so close even now. They were not ancient relics fading deep in prehistory. They were present almost within reach of the modern world. Their continued existence depended on conditions that nearly aligned often enough to sustain life, yet never quite aligned long enough to secure the future. That near miss is what gives their extinction its quiet weight. They did not disappear because survival was impossible. They disappeared because the window for survival closed just before they could pass through it. The mammoth story is therefore not one of inevitability, but of narrow margins where history could have unfolded differently without changing its entire shape. They stood on the edge of persistence, their fate resting on small shifts in time and sequence rather than overwhelming force. They came remarkably close to surviving, close enough that their absence today feels less like the end of an era and more like the result of a door closing just moments before they might have stepped through, leaving behind a world that continued on without ever quite noticing how narrowly it missed keeping them. The story of the mammoths leaves behind lessons that are quiet rather than dramatic, lessons drawn not from failure, but from endurance stretched to its limits. Mammoths were strong in every sense that strength can be measured. Their bodies were massive, insulated against cold, capable of pushing through snow, enduring hunger, and standing against predators. Strength allowed them to survive environments that would have crushed smaller, weaker animals. It carried them across ice ages, through long winters and into lands few other creatures could occupy. Yet strength alone did not secure their future. When the challenges they faced were no longer about physical resistance, but about rapid change, fragmentation, and loss of recovery, strength became less decisive. Muscles and mass could not reopen migration routes, stabilize climate patterns, or restore missing genetic variation. The mammoths teach that survival is not only about enduring pressure, but about whether pressure arrives in forms endurance can actually answer. Intelligence, too, was not enough. Mammoths were not simple animals guided only by instinct. They possessed memory, social awareness, and learned behaviors passed across generations. Herds navigated landscapes using knowledge accumulated over decades. Elders led movements based on remembered patterns of weather and food. This intelligence allowed mammoths to make fine-tuned decisions in familiar environments. It helped them avoid danger, locate resources, and coordinate within complex social structures. But intelligence depends on relevance. Knowledge built for stable systems loses power when the system itself becomes unpredictable. Remembering where grass grew decades earlier mattered less when vegetation shifted erratically. Knowing when winters usually arrived mattered less when seasons no longer followed reliable rhythms. Mammoth intelligence remained intact, but the world it had evolved to interpret stopped behaving in ways that intelligence alone could solve. Their minds continued to function, but the information they relied on aged faster than they could update it. Longevity, perhaps their greatest advantage for most of their history, also failed to protect them. Mammoths lived long lives, allowing experience to accumulate and social bonds to deepen. Longevity slowed population turnover, preserving successful traits and stable behaviors over time. In calm conditions, long life is a gift. It spreads risk across years, allowing animals to wait out short-term hardship, yet longevity also slows renewal. When change accelerates, long life means fewer opportunities for adaptation to spread. It means fewer births through which evolution can test new combinations. The mammoths' lives were so long that by the time one generation finished learning the world had already shifted again. Longevity preserved the past beautifully, but it struggled to keep pace with a future arriving too quickly. Taken together, these lessons reveal that survival is not a single trait, but a relationship between biology and environment. Mammoths had everything that once guaranteed success. Strength, intelligence, and long lives had carried them through immense spans of time. What they lacked was not capability, but flexibility at the scale and speed demanded by a changing planet. Survival requires not only the ability to endure, but the ability to adjust when endurance alone no longer aligns with conditions. Mammoths were built to withstand pressure, not to pivot rapidly when the nature of pressure changed repeatedly and unpredictably. This is why their extinction feels unsettling rather than dramatic. It challenges the comforting idea that the strongest, smartest, or longest lived will always persist. Mammoths did everything right according to the rules of their world. They survived climate extremes, predators, and scarcity long enough to seem almost unbreakable. Their disappearance shows that protection is contextual. Traits that ensure survival in one era can become insufficient in another without ever becoming wrong. The mammoths did not lose their strengths. The value of those strengths shifted. The deeper lesson the mammoths leave behind is that survival favors alignment over dominance. It favors traits that match the tempo and texture of change, not just the ability to resist hardship. Life persists not because it is powerful, but because it remains compatible with its surroundings. When that compatibility narrows, Even the most formidable creatures can find themselves living on borrowed time without realizing it. In the quiet end of the mammoths, there is no warning shouted loudly. There is only a reminder whispered through deep time. Strength can carry life far, but not everywhere. Intelligence can guide decisions, but not always rewrite conditions. Longevity can preserve success, but it does not guarantee a future. Survival is not a trophy awarded for excellence. It is an ongoing negotiation with a world that does not promise to stay still. And the mammoths teach us that even the greatest survivors can be outpaced when the terms of that negotiation change faster than life can answer. The mammoths stand in Earth's history as near survivors, not relics lost deep in frozen time, but living beings that came astonishingly close to carrying an Ice Age legacy into a very different world. They did not vanish alongside the retreating glaciers as once imagined. They lingered, adapted, endured, and followed the changing edge of cold far beyond where their story was expected to end. As climates warmed and landscapes rearranged, mammoths continued to live, breed, and move through shrinking versions of the world they had mastered. Their presence stretched so far forward in time that it nearly touched the beginnings of recorded human history. This alone reframes extinction not as an ancient inevitability, but as a process unfolding close enough to feel unfinished. Mammoths were not distant failures of evolution. They were recent participants in a planet still learning how to behave after the Ice Age loosened its grip. Their near survival reveals how thin the line between persistence and disappearance can be. Mammoths endured immense change, surviving waves of warming, habitat loss, isolation, and human presence long after many other giants were gone. They did not collapse when conditions first deteriorated. They adjusted, often impressively, holding on through periods that would have ended less resilient species. This endurance makes their final disappearance feel less like a clean ending and more like a narrow miss. They stood at the threshold of a transformed Earth, close enough that a slight pause in change or a small stretch of stability might have allowed them to continue. Their absence today is not proof that survival was impossible, but evidence that it became just barely unsustainable. This proximity to survival serves as a reminder of fragility that is easy to overlook when looking only at strength. Mammoths were large, capable, and deeply adapted, yet their story shows that resilience does not guarantee permanence. Survival is not held in place by a single trait, but by a balance between life and environment that can slip without dramatic warning. Mammoths did not lose their strength or intelligence at the end. They lost alignment. The systems that had supported them for hundreds of thousands of years changed just enough, just fast enough, to push survival outside the range their biology could comfortably occupy. Fragility does not mean weakness. It means dependence on conditions that can shift even when nothing appears broken in the moment. Their story also reframes survival as a temporary condition rather than a permanent state. Mammoths survived not because survival was guaranteed, but because for a long time the world remained compatible with the way they lived. When that compatibility narrowed, survival persisted briefly on momentum and accumulated adaptation. Eventually, momentum ran out. This does not diminish their success. It places it in context. Surviving for hundreds of thousands of years across extreme climates is extraordinary. That it ended does not erase that achievement. It simply reminds us that persistence has limits shaped by time, speed, and change. Mammoths almost outlasted the Ice Age because they were built for patience. They endured cold, scarcity, and pressure with bodies designed to store energy and minds shaped to remember landscapes over decades. Those qualities carried them far beyond the world that first formed them, yet patience alone cannot outrun rapid transformation. When the pace of environmental change surpassed the pace of biological response, survival became provisional. Mammoths lived within that provision for centuries, possibly longer, occupying a narrowing corridor where life remained possible but precarious. Their disappearance marks not a failure to survive, but the moment when survival ceased to be renewable. Seen this way, mammoths become something more than symbols of extinction. They become witnesses to a transition, living proof that Earth shifts do not always erase life immediately, but test it gradually until the space for continuation closes. Their near survival challenges simple stories of dominance and inevitability. It suggests that extinction can arrive even when a species does almost everything right, not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet misalignment. In remembering mammoths as a species that almost outlasted the Ice Age, we are reminded that survival is never owned, only borrowed. It lasts as long as conditions allow it to be replenished. The mammoths held that allowance for an astonishingly long time. That they eventually lost it does not make their story one of defeat, but of a long negotiation with a changing planet, a negotiation they nearly won, and one whose narrow conclusion leaves behind a lasting sense of how fragile even the most enduring lives can be when the world they depend on refuses to slow down. The extinction of the mammoths stands as the quietest ending Earth has known, not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked spectacle. There was no ending scene to frame it, no single place or moment where the last breath could be pointed to and remembered. The final mammoth did not fall beneath a storm or freeze beneath a collapsing sky. It did not die surrounded by witnesses or leave behind a trace that announced finality. Life simply stopped repeating itself. One season passed without a birth, then another, and somewhere within that quiet narrowing, the last individual lived out an ordinary life. When it ended, the world did not notice, because nothing about that day looked different from the countless days before it. The land still carried wind and snow, plants still followed their cycles. The silence that followed did not arrive suddenly, it settled slowly, unnoticed, until it became permanent. There was no final memory, because memory requires continuity, and continuity is exactly what ended. Mammoths had always passed their world forward through movement, presence, and repetition. Knowledge lived in bodies crossing land, in paths worn by countless feet, in shared rhythms that connected one generation to the next. When the last mammoth died, there was no one left to carry that memory forward. Nothing was written, nothing was recorded. The memory of mammoths did not end, it simply stopped being renewed. The earth did not archive their lives in a single moment. It absorbed their absence gradually, as it absorbs all things that no longer return. The landscapes they had shaped softened, trails faded, feeding grounds grew still. Over time, even the silence stopped sounding like silence and began to sound like normality. What was lost did not leave a gap that cried out. It left a space that filled with new routines. The world that kept going did so without hesitation. Seasons continued to turn, indifferent to which creatures moved through them. Snow fell where mammoths once packed it down. Grass grew without being grazed in familiar patterns. Shrubs rose taller where open ground had been maintained for thousands of years. Other animals adjusted, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, responding not to catastrophe, but to absence. The earth did not mourn. It does not possess that capacity. It adapts. It rebalances. It moves forward, carrying traces of the past, not as memories, but as layered outcomes. The mammoths became part of the deep background of change. Their influence spread thin across soil, vegetation, and time, no longer tied to living bodies. This is what makes their extinction so difficult to hold on to emotionally. There is no closing image to return to, no final sound to remember. Their story ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis that fades into continuation. The mammoths did not leave the world broken, they left it altered, subtly and permanently, in ways that only become visible when looking backward across long stretches of time. The earth that followed them is not worse or better in any simple sense. It is simply different, shaped by the absence of giants who once moved through it patiently, deliberately, and without awareness of how rare their endurance truly was. In the end, the quietest extinction is not defined by loss alone, but by how easily life accommodates it. The mammoths vanished without ceremony, and the world made room for that vanishing without pause. This does not diminish their significance, it sharpens it. Their disappearance reminds us that extinction does not always announce itself with destruction. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper that goes unheard because everything else is still speaking. The world continued, not because mammoths were unimportant, but because the world is built to continue regardless. And so we are left not with an ending scene, but with a realization. The mammoths lived for hundreds of thousands of years, shaping landscapes and surviving extremes, only to disappear so quietly that the moment of their passing dissolved into the rhythm of ordinary days. No final memory preserved them at the time, no signal marked their absence as it happened. There was only a world that kept going, carrying forward without mammoths in it, a world that still carries their story beneath its surface, waiting for careful attention to notice that something vast once walked here and then, without noise or warning, did not return.